Hiya, let's talk books. As it is the 20th anniversary of Harry Potter this year in July, so it was the 20th anniversary, which there's been a little bit of confusion. A lot of people are saying, no, it actually isn't the 20th anniversary because it was first published in 1997, so last year was the 20th anniversary, but this year is the 20th anniversary of the US edition. In honor of that, I decided to do a reread of the entire Harry Potter series because I haven't done it in a while. I reread them fairly frequently, particularly the first three. I haven't reread the 6th and 7th in a while, partially because they make me so emotional. They're really heartbreaking to me. So I really enjoy reading the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd. Plus those, you can pretty much read the first 3 in the amount of time that it takes you to read 4. So anyway, so it's been a long time since I did a reread, especially a binge reread, and that's what I did this time. I read all 7 in a row. I wanted to share a little bit of my experience and my thoughts as someone reading it many years later. Will not say how much. I am in my Marauders map t-shirt and I am ready to just start talking about the books. So the first one is Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. I almost didn't read Harry Potter because I read the first chapter and kind of found it boring as a kid, but my mom had actually read it and she kept insisting that I finish it. And so my mom actually read Harry Potter first and pushed me through it. I'm really grateful that she did because these books, as with many people, changed my life, and I can't imagine not having them in my life. I always wanted to be a writer, but reading these books really pushed that dream a lot for me. And even now as I read it, I can't help smiling the whole time. This book is, pardon the pun, but magical. You can't read it and not be happy. I'm convinced. So as I was rereading it, because, it's been a few years and I'm at a different place in my life than when I read it as I was younger, even just a couple years ago, I could kind of collect my thoughts a lot. And one of the things that I noticed was that some of my reactions to things have never changed. Like the introduction of Hagrid on the motorbike, and then again when he's rescuing Harry from the Dursleys. It's just amazing. He is so funny and so lovable. And then on top of it, knowing the end of the book, or knowing the end of the series, it's even more heartbreaking watching how much he loves Harry. Really genuinely loves Harry. And it's partially because he loved his parents so much, but knowing how much he loves Harry it becomes almost heartbreaking in the beginning when you know how it ends. Something else I noticed this go around, early on in his interactions with Snape, Harry makes a comment that it almost seems like he can read minds, and I kind of got a little giddy at that point because J.K. Rowling is just amazing at planting little seeds and then filling you in later. Yeah, that's what I meant by that. And knowing that he's a really experienced legitimate makes that line so much more poignant. Rereading the book also made me think about some of the things that they cut from the movie that I was kind of disappointed about. One of the main things from the first book that I was really disappointed they cut from the movie was Lee Jordan's announcing of Quidditch, because Lee Jordan is he's just a great announcer and it's hilarious the whole time. So the fact that they cut a lot of what he says and it's just a very typical sort of announcing, it's kind of disappointing, but reading it, I was laughing all over again. Another thing I missed in the movies was Peeves. In addition to that, kind of more of the ghosts. I wish they had more interactions with the ghosts like they have a lot more in the books. But specifically Peeves, because he was dropped from the movie altogether, and I kind of wonder about that because he does play kind of an important role in certain scenes. I love his mischief and just kind of the chaos that he causes. I really love that about him. The other thing I forgot was how involved Neville is with the plot throughout the whole book. He's much more involved than I had remembered, and rereading that made me fall in love with him even more. I think Neville's a great character. He has a bit of a crisis of being in Gryffindor just like Harry does. He and Harry have so many parallels, and obviously that's on purpose. Neville could have been the chosen one, but he wasn't. But I really enjoy the exploration of Neville's character, because when you first read these books, I feel like you fly through them. And like I said, I've reread them before, but there was something different about this time. I really paid attention to all the small details. The scene with the centaurs in the forest, they keep saying Mars is bright tonight, and Hagrid gets aggravated like they're not saying anything of importance. But in the 5th book, when Firenze is teaching divination, he talks about the way that the centaurs can interpret the skies a bit differently than the humans. So I wish we had more insight into what the centaurs believe they see in the sky, because Mars is bright tonight was probably very telling. He probably was telling Hagrid exactly what was going to happen, but because they felt they could not interfere, he couldn't spell it out for him. He just had to kind of tell him, these are the signs, you have to look at them, look at the sky, and it'll tell you what's going to happen. So Ronan really seemed to be trying to help, whereas Firenze was a lot more straightforward because he's more progressive in the centaurs. He doesn't seem to take a lot of the centaur statutes as seriously as the other centaurs, which is proven later on. Something that actually does kind of bother me about this is that there are, like, even though J.K. Rowling on Pottermore talks about the different houses and how they're all great for their own reasons, she does kind of create a situation through the first book that some houses are better than others. Some wizards in those houses are better than others. And one of the things, if you've seen my other videos, you know I'm a Hufflepuff, and she makes it seem like Hufflepuff is the worst. It's like a condemnation and not a sorting. And that really hurts me, especially because she says it's her favorite house, and the Hufflepuffs are the most valiant in the Battle of Hogwarts. So the fact that she really puts them down is kind of confusing to me, but it is what it is. I guess she kind of rectified it with Pottermore, but it's still kind of upsetting. And the other thing, reading the first book, that I kept thinking about, and I didn't really need a reread to remember this, but Dumbledore might be my favorite character in the entire series. I love him so much. He is so wise and great, and it just shows over the course of the books, but he's just so whimsical. I love him. I don't understand how anyone could not like Dumbledore, and I'm sure there are people out there who don't, but I really would like to hear their point of view, because I don't understand how you could ever read this book and not love Dumbledore. The second book is obviously Chamber of Secrets. And one of the major things that I kept thinking about reading this book, and this is probably a really unpopular opinion, but I think Ron was sorted wrong. And I think Harry was actually sorted right. I think Harry is a Gryffindor through and through. I think Hermione was probably a Ravenclaw, which at one point she does say that the Sorting Hat had a hat stall with her. But Ron Weasley was sorted very quickly, and I think he should have been in Hufflepuff. He always puts his friends first, always. He does want glory, but mostly because he's always in the shadow of someone else. But otherwise, he just always puts his friends first. Even if it puts himself in danger, he will do that just to protect his friends. And in the 7th book, which I'll talk about later, the Deluminator kind of shows how his friends are the most important thing to him. If glory was the most important thing to him, I think things would have gone very differently. But the fact that when he left them in the 7th book and the Deluminator ended up leading him back to his friends says a lot. I also think Dobby is really endearing, even from when he's really obnoxious in the beginning with Harry, and when he gets Harry in trouble. I still think he's super endearing. I loved him right away. I still love him. I'm glad that he's so involved in the books. It was really nice to get more Dobby, for sure. I also really love the introduction of the Weasleys and their house, and they are like a complete foil to the Dursleys. They're loving and chaotic and magical. I understand why Harry had to stay with the Dursleys, but if he could have stayed with the Weasleys, I think that's what I wanted for him. And I understand, for one thing, it wouldn't be as interesting if he was happy at the Weasleys, but you can't help but love them. And the other thing that I really love about them is that they're just themselves, and all of them are so different from each other, and they just accept each other, and that's what family does. They just accept each other for who they are. And Mrs. Weasley is clearly frustrated with Mr. Weasley's obsession with Muggle objects and enchanting them, but she accepts that that's something that he loves and doesn't interfere. She just kind of tisk-tisks him when it puts the kids in danger, like the car. Something that I really wondered about when I was reading this one was, why does Hermione get tricked by Lockhart? She is so smart. She usually figures out, especially in later books, she figures things out before most of the other students. So why is it that she is tricked by Lockhart and sort of falls under his spell? She's not really shown as the type of person to fall for someone just for their looks, so that can't be it. So the only thing I can think of is that she respects his intelligence so much, and he was a Ravenclaw, and like I said before, I think she was supposed to be a Ravenclaw. Regardless of the Hatstall and final decision of Gryffindor, I still think she's technically a Ravenclaw. Because she values intelligence so much, and he seems to be so intelligent, that's why she fell under his spell. But it was frustrating to me that someone who is so smart in every other way fell under Lockhart's spell. Even after the whole like Cornish Pixies thing, she still felt like he was amazing, and I just didn't get it. There are some things that are portrayed in the movie that I think might be a little bit more powerful than in the book, not just the second book, over the course of the series. There are some things that I think were done really well in the movies. So, for example, in the book, when Draco calls Hermione a mudblood, she doesn't know what that means, and it has to have it explained to her. But in the movie, she does know what it is, and she gets very upset. And she's the one who explains to Harry what it means. And I think that's more powerful because it shows that the prejudice and history of racism in the wizarding world is so pervasive that Hermione would have read about it in her books. You learn about Filch's squib status in the Chamber of Secrets, and it does give you kind of a little bit of compassion for him, especially because he's policing a school of students with magic with no magic. And so not only is he resentful, but he's essentially in danger every day, and he has to rule with like an iron fist so that people don't find out that he can't actually do any of this stuff, so they don't attack him. So that does make you have a little bit of compassion for him, but over the course of the books, he's so awful that it's hard to hold on to that compassion. And it kind of shows you how circumstances can shape someone's personality more so than the concept of nature shaping someone's personality, because Filch feels powerless and he needs to exert power over others in order to regain a little bit of that feeling of self-control over his life. I kind of have asked myself this a lot about a lot of actions over the course of the books, but in this one especially, at one point Dumbledore is asking Harry if he has something to tell him, because Harry has been hearing the basilisk, and Dumbledore knows, somehow. And Harry says no, he has nothing to tell him. And so I kind of wonder if the course of events of the book would have gone differently if Harry had told him. But at the same time, it always seems like Dumbledore knows anyway, and he kind of allows Harry and Ron and Hermione to make their own mistakes. So there's sort of this kind of push and pull internally for me of, should Harry and Hermione and Ron pull Dumbledore into these situations, or should they try to navigate it themselves like they do? So something that is kind of interesting throughout these books is that a lot of the characters have gone through really traumatic events. So some people, like Hagrid, when he's approached about going back to Azkaban and the way he reacts, it kind of makes me wonder if J.K. Rowling is hinting at things like PTSD. But I do kind of wonder if a couple of the characters have PTSD. Hagrid in this one, Harry Potter later, Hermione later, all that kind of stuff. You kind of wonder what effect would these inexplicable magical events that have traumatized the characters have on them in their life. With The Prisoner of Azkaban, I can't remember how I reacted to things when I first read it. Because now that I know who Sirius is, I know who the dog is, I know who Wormtail is, I don't remember how I felt about all that stuff in the beginning, because I can't erase knowing that stuff. So when I reread it, I always I get a little bit of a flutter in my chest, I guess, when Harry sees the black dog when he's on Privet Drive, because then you know that it's Sirius coming to get a look at Harry, and Sirius loves Harry so much, he had loved his parents so much, that it's very touching. He risked getting caught, and he risked losing Wormtail just to see Harry. We're first introduced to Cornelius Fudge in this book, and I really hate him. I don't think there's a single book where I actually like that character. I think you're meant to hate him because he's slimy and cowardly, but I definitely hate him. Like, that is not even a question. At one point in this book, Harry says, "I don't go looking for trouble. Trouble usually finds me." And when I read that line, yes, to some degree that's true, but I kind of chuckled because I was like, really, Harry? You don't go looking for trouble? You didn't go out looking for the stone? He does go looking for trouble, and he's not very he's 13, but I just thought it was funny that there's actually a point in the book where Harry says, "I don't go looking for trouble." The other thing that's really interesting, knowing the full extent of the series when you're reading this, is that they keep saying the sneakoscope is broken when it is clearly not. It is clearly working very well, and a lot of problems probably could have been solved if they had listened to it, but they were so convinced it was broken that they just ignored it. At one point in this book, Neville is compared to Peter Pettigrew. He is not as brave as the other Gryffindors, and he's always kind of seen trailing after Ron, Hermione, and Harry. That kind of mirrors the Marauders a little bit. I thought that was really interesting because it kind of touches on how your choices make you who you are, not who you are born. Neville is not very brave, but in the end he ends up making very brave choices, whereas Wormtail was never very brave, and in the end he ended up making very cowardly choices. So even though they may be similar in some ways, there's a really drastic divergence there somewhere. Knowing Snape's backstory too is also really illuminating, not just for the Legitimens comment, but also because it makes his hatred of a lot of characters really telling. Namely Neville Longbottom. I feel really bad for Neville in a lot of ways, very particularly because of how Snape treats him, because Snape blames him for the fact that Lily is dead, just like he hates Harry because she died to save him. Neville could have been the one targeted by Lord Voldemort, and he wasn't, and because of that, Lily is dead. It's very telling, and it makes you feel for a lot of the characters. Even Snape a little bit, though, once again, it's your choices that make you, and Snape chooses to take out his grief on others, which makes him not a great person. So many questions about the Marauders come up when you read the series, and I know a lot of people have said this, but I really want a backstory on the Marauders. Like, how did they make the map? How did they interact with each other? We kind of get Sirius and James a lot, but not very much of Lupin and Sirius or Lupin and James. You hear about Wormtail trailing along with the others. How did they actually treat him? That kind of stuff. And then also, how were they viewed by their peers and their teachers? Like, this is the stuff that I need to know. What was the life of the Marauders like? That's what I really want to know that. And I know there's some information on Pottermore, but it's not the same as getting like a full-blown book. Harry's Patronus makes me so sad. Expecto Patronum in Latin means I expect a guardian, and his guardian is a stag, and his father was a stag and a magus. So literally his guardian is his father, and that just totally breaks my heart. Then there's that quote, "You found him within yourself," and there's very few Harry Potter books you can read and not get emotional. But Harry still has that connection to his parents, and there's something incredibly amazing about that. And at one point, Dumbledore says there's a bond that is created between wizards when one saves the other's life. Something else I think about when I reread these, Sirius is incredibly generous. Sometimes I think he has so much money and he has nothing to do with it, so maybe it's just him throwing money around. But he could throw it around on himself, and he tends to give it to other people, and eventually he supplies his house to the Order, and he's just very, very generous. There's very little bad you can actually say about Sirius other than that he's arrogant and a show-off. The Goblet of Fire was always my favorite book. 6 and 7 now run really close behind. But I love the 7th one. I love that you get the introduction of other wizard cultures. The magical creatures in it are amazing. Hagrid gets more responsibility because he's been exonerated. To be fair, you can do more with more pages, but I still love this one so much. I actually was able to go see the movie while the orchestra was playing the music, which was such a cool experience. I would highly recommend that to anyone. There's that moment in the beginning where Mr. Weasley kind of rails into the Dursleys for treating Harry like crap. I loved that moment, partially because Harry can threaten the Dursleys with magic, but he can't do anything. But Mr. Weasley actually can do something. He wouldn't, but he could, and the Dursleys know that, and so I feel like even in the long run it didn't really have much effect, but in the short term it kind of made them realize like maybe they should be nicer. I also love anything about how the wizards interpret Muggle concepts. So like anytime Mr. Weasley talks about a Muggle concept, I just crack up. Like the way that J.K. Rowling was able to think about very ordinary concepts from a very new light is really impressive to me. She makes something as simple as plumbing very funny. I don't understand why Harry isn't 100% involved in Spew. S-P-E-W. Not only is he friends with Dobby and he set Dobby free, he's also been in the position where he's been constrained and treated like a servant. He knows what it feels like, so I don't understand how he isn't really gung-ho and right on board with Hermione. Throughout the whole series, but I think especially in this one, you kind of see how Dumbledore is still kind of a kid at heart. And I think that is one of those things where Dumbledore is seen as the wise old man, but I think part of that wisdom is understanding that youth is important. And there's a certain wisdom in youth that you could carry to your old age, and he does. He's always encouraging mischief and frivolity, and I'm not really sure if it's because it amuses him and he likes to bring mischief into his own life, or because he believes that the best way to learn is by doing. But I also think it's partially because he's lived through such dark times that he does believe that frivolity needs to be snatched up whenever it can, because it can be taken away just as fast. Something else I wonder is why Harry is the one who's able to resist the Imperious Curse. And I don't think we ever get like a sufficient answer throughout the series. That kind of bothers me. I just want to understand, is it because he's strong-willed? Because that's certainly true. Is it because he has part of Voldemort in him, and so he has that like strength and darkness, so like maybe his darkness can resist other darknesses? I don't know, but I don't think we get a legitimate response to that. Just a note on the Triwizard Tournament. My favorite part of the entire tournament is the Sphinx. Just like my favorite part of them going to get the stone was the logic puzzle with the potions. Like Hermione, I love logic puzzles, so that was awesome to me. And when I saw the movie, I was devastated that they took the Sphinx out. I think if they ever remade the movies, they might put it back in just because CGI capabilities are much better now. But that was my favorite part, which is probably pretty silly to some people because there are so many other fantastical, like the dragon is probably most people's favorite. I don't know if that's true, that's just what I'm assuming, but it's the most action-packed part. But for me, it was the Sphinx. When you read the graveyard scene, what I find really interesting is that as much as Voldemort says he wants Harry dead, he doesn't actually seem to want Harry dead. He's very hesitant to kill Harry. He keeps talking. He's doing the typical villain monologue. But he also seems to have this curiosity about Harry. How did Harry defeat him? How could Harry possibly have power that he doesn't have? So he seems to keep him alive just to prove he's superior, which of course is his downfall, because in the graveyard he could have ended the whole thing. But he didn't. He needed to duel Harry to prove that he was superior, and then Harry got away. And so I think that is really interesting, that is that hubristic curiosity that Voldemort has, thinking like he just wants to find some stuff out, and he's superior, so it doesn't matter how long it takes to kill Harry because he'll kill him anyway, is a really interesting aspect of Voldemort as a character. The Order of the Phoenix, Harry is so angry, he's always yelling at people, he's taking his anger out on him. I sympathize with Harry a lot. I feel like he went through some really traumatic events. He was the first one to face down Voldemort when Voldemort came back, and they treated him like a kid. So I totally sympathize with him. It's not my least favorite. I know quite a few people who say they don't like this one. It's long and he's angry and it's not enjoyable, but this is not my least favorite one, actually. After Dudley is attacked by the Dementors and Harry tells them what happened, Mrs. Dursley knows what Dementors are, which made me wonder, did Lily tell her? I know Snape told Lily about them. Did Lily tell her sister? How much did she know? Why was she so scared? Like I said before, I don't mind the anger that Harry has in this book, and I never did, but I am finding that the older I get, the more empathy I have for Harry. Again, the idea of PTSD comes up. I kind of wonder if J.K. Rowling is hinting at PTSD or some sort of anxiety disorder that the Wizards just don't really have a word for, I guess. And of course we know that the Dementors are a representation of depression, and that's another thing that I always get a little bit teary-eyed thinking about, because it is really an excellent depiction of what depression feels like. The interesting thing from this point on in the series is that Dumbledore's philosophy on how to treat children is drastically different from the rest of the adults. The adults are constantly trying to protect them and keep them away from the danger and everything, whereas there's a point in the series where Dumbledore says it's dangerous to underestimate the power of youth and the strength, which also makes it more frustrating that Dumbledore didn't trust Harry with occlumency lessons with him, because he was afraid that Voldemort would look through him and see Dumbledore and it would cause a problem. I think there's something to the fact that kids or younger people tend to be willing to risk a lot more, because the older you get, the more you realize what you could lose. Like Mrs. Weasley, her boggart is everyone dying, which is heartbreaking, but it's part of why she treats her family like they're eggs and they could break at any second. Whereas those are some of the strongest wizards alive at the moment, except for Percy, because I don't really understand how he ended up in Gryffindor. He's such a weasel. And he's so, like, ambitious. He kind of seems more like a Slytherin, which is really interesting that he ended up in Gryffindor. Dumbledore says at one point in the series, I think we sort too early. Maybe Percy started out different, because we never see Percy when he's young. Maybe over time, because we do know that part of his ambition is because he doesn't want to be poor like his family. So that's why he's so ambitious. Maybe he was different when he was younger, and he became more ambitious and less about courage and nobility. But in any case, he does not act like you expect a Gryffindor to act. I'm going to put out another unpopular opinion. And maybe it's not unpopular, maybe it's pretty popular. Cho and Harry make no sense. Literally none. And I think the only reason that Harry even likes her is because he thinks she's pretty. They have nothing in common except for Cedric, which is super, super morbid. And it seems like the only reason she wants to be with Harry is so that she can talk about Cedric, which is not only morbid, it's really awkward. Like, yes, Harry's the only one who understands, but she can't really understand his side of it. Like, she didn't watch Cedric die. So I don't like Harry and Cho. I don't like Cho as a character, to be perfectly honest. I think she's annoying. So I was really glad that it doesn't last past this book. I'm not sure which death in the series is the saddest. For a long time, I thought it was Sirius. Now I kind of waffle, and I really have to think about that. Harry seems to lose everyone who's close to him, and I kind of think it's necessary so that he can walk into death's arms like an old friend. He doesn't have any attachments to the world, so he can freely sacrifice himself to save the world, because he's not really, I mean, he's leaving Ron and Hermione alone, but they have each other, and he knows that. So when he decides to sacrifice himself, he's not leaving Sirius, he's not leaving his parents. So I think it motivates him. Like, so many people have died by the Death Eater's hands that he has to put a stop to it. But it is really heartbreaking that Harry can't seem to make any emotional connections without them being severed eventually. That changes later in the series, of course, but up to this point, that's what it feels like. Once again, Dumbledore is my favorite character. When he tells Harry about his destiny and he explains the prophecy, he's crying. He feels guilty and he loves Harry and he just wants to protect Harry too. But unlike everyone else, even though he wants to protect Harry, he knows that he can't, and he knows that Harry has a dark destiny that he can't escape. And he says that one line, I hope you'll forgive me not making you prefect. I quite think you had enough responsibility. I hate Umbridge a lot. J.K. Rowling is really good at creating characters that you both completely love and completely loathe, and I hate Umbridge. I think she is possibly more evil than Voldemort. Maybe. So I was really frustrated when she came out of the forest seemingly unscathed. Of course, she's skittish about centaurs the rest of her life. But why did they let her go when she did such terrible things and they're so violent? That was a plot hole in my mind. How did she get free? How did she escape? And I do wish we had a little bit more explanation. It might be on Pottermore. I have to check, but that is something that definitely frustrated me about this one. After I read The Half-Blood Prince the first time, I literally read it the day it came out. Back then, I literally cried for 3 days. I'm not exaggerating, because my mom and I read them together, but I read them first because I read them faster. So I read them, and then I gave the book to her, and then she read them, and it took her 3 days to finish it. And every single time she looked at me, I burst into tears because I hadn't told anyone what had happened. I hadn't talked about it. I was still young enough that I wasn't like out and about all the time. So every time she looked at me, just burst into tears. And I really thought, being older and knowing it's coming and knowing that the whole thing was orchestrated anyway, I would not cry, and I was wrong. I still sob every time I read this one. Like I said, Dumbledore is my favorite character, so that's kind of understandable. But to have such a strong emotional reaction to something that you have read multiple times is kind of amazing. The fact that J.K. Rowling wrote such a powerful story that it elicits that intensity of an emotion 20 years after the fact is amazing. And Rowling's introductory chapters are so unique and so fun. I love this one probably the most. The interaction between the two ministers, I think it's really whimsical and fun. The reactions of the Muggle minister are really funny. And of course it like reminds you of what happened and also what was happening between books 5 and 6. And then of course we have Dumbledore coming to the Dursleys' house, telling them off for how they treated Harry, despite the fact that he left Harry in their care. I mean, the Dursleys have been told off by other wizards, but that was really compelling to me because Dumbledore is Harry's father figure since Sirius died. The Dursleys' reaction when he said, at least Harry didn't turn out like Dudley, was hilarious because they had no idea they even ruined Dudley. Like, we do, but they are completely oblivious. Which just goes to show that either end of the spectrum, complete spoiling or complete neglect, are both damaging to a child. I'm kind of curious about Malfoy's mother because she tries to stop Malfoy from fulfilling Voldemort's orders. I'm still a little bit conflicted about this because I assume it's because she thinks he's going to fail and that Voldemort will kill him. But also part of me wonders if she knows that killing corrupts someone's soul and she doesn't want Malfoy's soul to be corrupted, in which case that she's a better person than you think. But then you turn around and like a couple pages later she's saying mudblood and being racist and prejudiced and terrible. So it's hard to understand Narcissa Malfoy, but I think that's kind of part of the point, that people can be bad, but not all bad. People can be good, but not all good. Rowling really plays with those shades of gray. The other thing that I forgot about this book, because I've watched the movies more than I've read the books, is that Tonks is more involved in the books. I forgot how much. She saves Harry on the train, not Luna. Although I do kind of miss the connection with Luna a little bit, but I do enjoy the fact that Tonks is the one to save Harry. Tonks is the one to show up and be patrolling and protecting Harry, even though she's actually not that much older than him. We learn a lot more about Dumbledore and Voldemort in this one, and how they do kind of have some similarities, but diverged in their choices a lot. Like, neither Dumbledore nor Voldemort wanted the Ministry of Magic position. And we find out later that Dumbledore says it's because he couldn't be trusted with power, but at the same time he believes in the power of youth. So I always kind of thought maybe he felt that he could make more of a positive difference in the world by teaching children, whereas he would be constricted by bureaucracy in the ministry. On the other hand, Voldemort didn't want to be part of the ministry because he wanted to overthrow it and rule everyone, and he didn't want to be constrained by normal governmental constraints. Dumbledore also tells Harry that Voldemort wanted the position of Defense Against the Dark Arts, basically to recruit an army, and when Dumbledore refused him, he cursed the role, and that's why they have never had a teacher more than a year in that role. And so then I started thinking, did Dumbledore deny Snape the role of Defense Against the Dark Arts because he honestly wanted to keep him from being tempted for the Dark Arts? Or was it because he wanted to keep him around and he knew he would only be around another year if he taught Defense Against the Dark Arts? That was kind of an intriguing thought that I had during that whole exchange, wondering how much Dumbledore controlled the situation with Snape versus wanted to protect Snape. But Dumbledore is always kind of a fuzzy line, especially since he always seems to know everything that's going to happen. And I always kind of wonder, is that because he is a skilled legitimens, or because he's really perceptive and logical, or because he uses a time turner? That's something that's always popped into my head. When I read his death, I really thought I was going to be okay, and I wasn't. I cried. It still just completely guts me. I cried after Sirius, but it was nothing like crying after Dumbledore, because he's my favorite character, but he also is a father figure to basically all the students, and losing him was such a great loss. There's a moment in the beginning of this book where Mrs. Weasley says, "What would we do without that man?" And when I read that, I got a little emotional because I was thinking, little does she know. The grief over Dumbledore continues in the Deathly Hallows, and a lot of the grief that Harry describes and a lot of the things that he felt really reminded me of the grief I felt over my grandfather, who died about 2 years ago. I think that's part of why I still feel so emotional with Dumbledore. He does remind me a lot of my grandfather, who I was very close to. So a lot of the Deathly Hallows deals with Harry dealing with the fact that he didn't know he had so little time with Dumbledore, and the fact that he feels like he didn't know Dumbledore. In Rita Skeeter's book, The Life and Lies of Albus Dumbledore, she includes that letter between him and Grindelwald. And in the letter, he says that he believes that they should overthrow the secrecy law for the greater good. Not that I defend Dumbledore, because his actions as a young man were deplorable. But whereas Grindelwald wanted to be violent and Dumbledore warned against that, and Grindelwald wanted to conquer the Muggles, I think Dumbledore wanted to sort of rule over them peacefully, just so that Muggles and wizards could live peacefully together. But I also think he realized that working with Grindelwald, that would never happen. He realized the error of his action. Unfortunately, in the process, his sister died, and he regretted it for the rest of his life. And I think Dumbledore's whole life story is a reiteration of the idea, it is not who we are born that defines us, it is who we become to be. So he was trying constantly to teach Harry, look at how a person has decided to transform, not at the bad choices they made decades and decades ago. And I think that's really interesting because it sets up for Snape. Snape made some terrible mistakes, but he spent his life trying to make up for them, trying to find a way to live with himself, which I don't think he ever did. I think he regretted his actions until the moment he died, but he wanted to find a way to live a life that would at least somewhat make him the person that he wanted to be for Lily. On a similar note, that happened with Dudley a little bit. His goodbye with Harry was incredibly touching. I think the fact that he was never really taught how to love, how to express love, he was always just told he was the best and he was coddled and all that kind of stuff, is part of why his goodbye to Harry is kind of odd. He really was showing that he loved Harry, and Harry was such a big part of his life, and he didn't want him to die, but he didn't know how to properly express it. According to, I don't know if it's The Cursed Child or Pottermore, but according to one of those, he and Harry eventually were on Christmas card terms and their children played together and all that kind of stuff. So it really shows that you don't have to be your parents, you can change, just like Dumbledore did, just like Sirius did, just like James did, and just like Snape did. But then Petunia stopped at the door and seemed like she was going to say something, but we don't get what Petunia was going to say. And I'm really curious what she was going to say, because after all, she thought she may be saying goodbye to Harry forever, and that was her only connection that was left to her sister. And so that must have been heartbreaking for her. But she never said it because she's too stubborn, she's not brave enough. Just like I want a story of the Marauders, I also want a story of Regulus Black, because I think it would be really interesting to see how someone who grew up in the House of Black, very prejudiced, and so he's taught prejudice his whole life, and then eventually became a follower of Voldemort, how he turned away, what made him make those decisions, what drove him as a character. I really want to see that. So I kind of hope one day that will come out. And I don't mean like a simple page on Pottermore, I mean like a full-blown book. Because it would be really interesting to get the perspective of a quote-unquote villain. Voldemort seems to be afraid of Dumbledore even after Dumbledore's dead, which is really interesting. It kind of reminds me of the whole idea that Dumbledore is never truly gone while those who are loyal to him remain. But he was so scared of Dumbledore that even Dumbledore being dead, he's still insecure. It's kind of fast. He's so convinced he's the most powerful wizard, but he's terrified of Dumbledore. And then throughout the book, there's all these reminders of how powerful and dangerous fear can be, because it's not only self-destructive, but it's also an easy tool to manipulate someone, and that does happen a lot in this book. Like, Ron was more affected by the locket because he had more insecurity. He was fearful of a lot of things, and the locket preyed on him. He felt like an outcast his whole life. He always felt like he was shadowed by he was in his brother's shadows, and then in Harry's shadow, and he feared that he wasn't good enough, and so the locket preyed on that. So Ron's insecurities and fears were able to be used against him later on. Of course, he conquered them, but they were used against him initially. When we get the full story behind Snape, something that I've never understood is, if he was truly in love with Lily, how could he ever become a Death Eater with people who felt like people like her should die, and people like her should never be allowed to have magic? How could he use the word mudblood knowing that it was a hateful term against the woman he loved? I never understood that. I still don't understand it. But I think it's also because his love of Lily is a very possessive love, like how he was willing to offer up Harry for Lily to Voldemort. And Dumbledore says that's completely despicable. I can't believe you did that, except he kind of could, I guess. But even so, it just doesn't make logical sense to me. Especially because I think Lily represented the good that was in Snape, and so without Lily, Snape was essentially evil, and the memory of Lily is what kept him good. The remorse over the fact that he was responsible for Lily's death is what kept him good. I also love how you get a lot of insight into Dumbledore through Snape's memories. Dumbledore knew about Quirrell. How much, we don't know, but again, I'm struck with the whole, how does Dumbledore know so much? He always seems to know everything that's going to happen. He also believed that asking Snape to use Avada Kedavra on him, or just eliminate him in some way, was okay. Asking, when we know that murder rips apart someone's soul, he thought asking Snape would be okay because asking Snape was asking for a mercy kill because he was dying anyway and he'd rather die by Snape's hand than Greyback's or Bellatrix. Whereas with Malfoy, it would rip apart his soul because it would be done in a very evil way. He would be doing it on Voldemort's orders. He would not have a reason to do it, so it would rip apart his soul. The whole idea of the Hallows is really fascinating to me because this idea that you could conquer death and the fact that Dumbledore sought the Hallows is another way that you can see the parallel between Voldemort and Dumbledore, because Voldemort ended up with Horcruxes to keep himself immortal, but Dumbledore was seeking immortality through the Hallows, and if you remember, he was also seeking immortality through the Philosopher's Stone, which he helped create with Nicholas Flamel. When we see his situation in Snape's memory, it seems like he's not afraid of death. So why is it that for a long time he was trying to resist death so much? And the thing with the Hallows is that only the right wizard could ever really use them because they had to be used in the right way. Like the Elder Wand had to be used with humility, which most people who sought the Elder Wand would not be the type of wizard to be humble like that. They would gloat and brag and end up pulling their death toward them instead of away from them. And the Resurrection Stone is meant to be used to have the spirits usher you to your death rather than bring spirits back to life because they are tortured that way. When Harry finally meets Dumbledore in the King Cross Station of Death, Dumbledore says he's so proud of him and that he's a better man and that he should hate him, but Harry doesn't hate Dumbledore for what he did. Dumbledore hates himself, and that says a lot about Dumbledore, that even after he died, he still regretted everything he did. He never really felt like he redeemed himself because he felt there was no redemption for what he did. And that is the contrast to a lot of the other characters who are constantly trying to prove that they were better or that they were worth it or that they could redeem themselves. I don't know that Snape ever believed he could redeem himself, but he was trying to redeem himself, whereas I think Dumbledore was constantly trying to do good to make up for what he did, knowing he could never do enough. And maybe that's why he chased immortality, because he wanted more time to make up for the things that he did. One of the reasons that Dumbledore is my favorite character, not just of the series, but possibly of all time, is because some of his quotes are the most amazing quotes, and they just stick in my head constantly. They just pop into my head. I think everyone would know what quote I'm talking about with this one, but it is, of course it is happening inside your head, Harry, but why on earth would that mean it's not real? I still get chills every time I read it. It's just phenomenal. It professes the importance of storytelling. It professes the importance of how you feel and how human experience is personal, and it's just a whole lot of wisdom in one sentence. The thing that's really interesting about when Voldemort exposes Harry's death to Hogwarts is that he lies. He says that Harry was running away and he killed him as he was running away like a coward. He could have said he dueled Harry and he killed him in a duel, proving he's the stronger wizard, but instead he tells them that Harry is a coward because he has to discount Harry. He has to discount Dumbledore. He has to discount Harry. He has to make sure no one has any role models and that he is the tippy top of everybody's thought, which kind of proves a cowardice in him. Like, he's not courageous enough to stand on his own 2 feet. He has to make sure that no one else is around. Harry ends up killing Voldemort with Expelliarmus, but not because the spell kills him, because his spell creates a rebound of Voldemort's Avada Kedavra, and that's how he dies. It shows how you can win a war with peace. Technically, Expelliarmus is a defensive spell. Harry Potter never attacked Voldemort with an offensive spell. He was constantly just defending himself, and it was Voldemort's own aggression and hatred that killed him. I kind of wonder if Harry using Avada Kedavra on Voldemort would have changed Harry in the long run, because in this way he maintained his innocence to some degree. He was just defending himself, and essentially Voldemort had been killed by his own spell. And then of course Harry destroyed all the Hallows except for the cloak, which we all know is the only one that is wise to keep. So it proves that Harry is very wise, and Dumbledore says he's a good man, and it proves that he's a good man. He wasn't going to exploit the Hallows. I kind of wonder if he kept the Elder Wand, what would have happened, but he just wanted his old wand. He wanted to go back to who he was. He didn't want to be this super powerful wizard. He just wanted to be Harry, just Harry. And my last comment on this one would be that Unlike most people, I don't hate the epilogue. I don't always read the epilogue. I don't really think it's necessary. I think it could have ended before the epilogue. But on the other hand, I really love these characters, almost like they're real people, and the epilogue allows them to be happy. We know that they went on to live happy lives and productive lives. There's something really satisfying about the happily ever after feel of the last book. I have now reread Harry Potter in its entirety while taking notes, which I don't think I've ever taken notes reading Harry Potter before. I have some overall thoughts about the series, other than it's amazing. One of them is that J.K. Rowling really wants to drive home that kindness is key. Any sort of hatred will lead to your destruction. I think she also wants to talk a lot about nature versus nurture. You can be born into a hateful family. It's your choices that define you. Just like with Sirius, Sirius was brought up in a very prejudiced, hateful family, but he managed to escape that, and he managed to come out a better person. And of course, I think the overarching message is that love is the most powerful magic of all, which is a theme in a lot of fantasy books. It really, really is strong in Harry Potter. It's still my favorite series of all time. I don't think that'll ever change. I will definitely be reading this over and over and over again, and then hopefully to my theoretical children over and over and over again. But in the meantime, as always, there are so many books and so little time. So I'm gonna go read, and I will see you in my next video. Bye!